In the meantime, you should just sometimes repeat their questions.
Yes, okay, right. You don't, because you don't hear the questions of people in the room. I realize that.
Yes,
Okay,
right.
I realize that. All right.
It's more fun from the answers to guess the questions.
It's more fun from the answers to guess the questions. All right. So we're going to begin. We're going to begin with Fern's question from last week. If you remember, Fern last week asked the question, how could the daughters of Tzalafcha deliberately postpone getting married until the youngest of them was over the age of 40? After all, we learned, and this is the Gemara that we learned in Maseches Baba Basra last week, that if you get married above the age of 40, it's very difficult to conceive. And the Gemara answered, and the Gemara said that because Benos Tzlafchad were righteous, so as a result of their righteousness, Hashem performed a miracle. And what was the miracle? And the miracle was that these women over 40 conceived and bore children. Now, perhaps today that's not such a miracle. There are women over 40 who conceive and bear children. The Gemara said we see these miracles of women conceiving and bearing children at an advanced age. And the Gemara brought the example of Yocheved, who actually conceived Moshe Rabbeinu at the age of 130, I think it was 130. Okay. So the question is, right? So the question is, did they do something wrong by postponing getting married and waiting until there was clarity of the circumstances of inheritance, which is obviously what it seems was their motivation. They were unclear as to what would be the halacha regarding inheritance, and they deliberately postponed getting married as a result of that lack of clarity. That's what the Gemara seems to be saying, and for that they are known as tzidkanios. They are known as righteous. So we need to, so Fern asked last week, wait a second, Ein somchen al hanes. It was very nice that there was an ace. It was very nice that miraculously they conceived past the age of 40 and they bore children. But how could they do that lichatchila? How could they put themselves in that position? And as Fern asked, how could they be called tzidkanios for having put themselves in that position? So I think just to unpack it a little bit, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Granted, there is a principle of Ein Somchin al Hanes that we do not rely on miracles, but we have to do our hishtadlus. We have to put in our effort. It's not sufficient just to say, I'm a good guy, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to do a miracle for me. We know and we all understand that we don't do that. We don't rely on miracles. However, let's understand, what did Benos Tzalafcha do wrong by postponing getting married? Is there an obligation upon a woman to be married at a particular age? Is there an obligation on a woman to get married at all? Right? So let's understand whether or not there is an obligation on anyone to get married. Is there such an obligation?
The man. It's the male. Peru is
Okay, so now we're confusing a couple of things, okay? Right? We're confusing a couple of things. We say that Tina points out that there is an obligation of Peru Orvu, which I think is what prompted Fern's question from last week. That there is an obligation, right? There is an obligation of Peru Orvu, of being fruitful and multiplying, an obligation of having children. Upon whom is that obligation of having children? Is that on the man, or is that on the woman, or is that on both of them? So the halacha, the halacha is that obligation is an obligation upon the man. Now, we're all smart enough and experienced enough to know that the man can't do this alone, right? That there needs to be a man and a woman in order to conceive a child. Well, that's not actually true. There needs to be, right? I guess There needs to be what a man is capable of producing and what a woman is capable of producing in order for there to be a child. I think we're pretty much at the point where a child can certainly be conceived. A child can certainly be conceived outside of a womb. I don't think we're at the point where a child can go from conception to birth outside of the womb. I don't think that we're at that point. Not yet, but we might one day be at that point. But basically, for our understanding, for the purpose of understanding, you need a man and a woman in order to conceive. Right? You need a man and a woman in order to conceive, in order for the woman to conceive. So the obligation of Peru Urvu is on a man, but clearly that can't be fulfilled without that man getting married and having a wife with whom to have relations and through whom children can be born. Okay, so there's a difference in halachic obligation. If a man postpones getting married, he is postponing the mitzvah of Peru Urvu. I don't want to get involved in the question of can he fulfill the mitzvah of Peru Urvu outside of marriage. In other words, maybe it's possible, maybe it's conceivable that he can fulfill the obligation of Peru Urvu outside of marriage. I don't want to get involved with that question. Let's say, can a man postpone getting married and thereby postpone fulfilling the mitzvah of Peru Urvu? This is a fundamental question when it comes to, again, whoever is talking. I'm just going to mute you, ask you to mute yourselves unless you want to talk about class. So this is a fundamental question when a couple gets married about the use of birth control. Is birth control permissible within halacha? If it is permissible, for how long is it permissible? If it is permissible, not only for how long is it permissible, but what method of birth control is permissible? These are questions that pretty much today every young couple who gets married grapples with, right? Now, there are some communities where people simply don't ask the question. They just do what they do. They don't ask the question. But for a couple that's committed to halacha, living in a religious community, rabbis expect this to happen. Rabbis expect people to come and ask this question about birth control. And the fundamentals that make up the answer to this question revolve around understanding upon whom is the obligation of multiplying, of being fruitful and multiplying. Upon whom is that obligation? That obligation is upon the man. That obligation is upon the man. That creates certain potential leniencies when it comes to methods of birth control, but the obligation is on the man. So by the man postponing getting married and thereby postponing the mitzvah of Peru Urvu, Thelma Katan. Thelma, thank you. Okay, right? The man is postponing the fulfillment of this positive commandment. That's questionable. That's problematic. Are you allowed to postpone the fulfillment of a commandment? You have a commandment, you have a positive commandment, you have an obligation. Are you allowed to postpone the fulfillment of that positive commandment? There might be circumstances where you are allowed to do it and circumstances where you're not allowed to do it. However, back to Fern's question, if a woman doesn't get married, is she postponing the mitzvah of Peru Urvu? The question seemingly would be answered by no, that she is not postponing the mitzvah of Peru Urvu. Why? Because she doesn't have the mitzvah of Peru Urvu. This is a mitzvah that is commanded to the man. Since she doesn't have that obligation, then her getting married is not considered a postponing of that positive obligation. So Fern, I want to question the very fundamental of your question, which was the fundamental assumption of your question is that the women were doing something wrong by waiting until they were past the age of 40, at which point conception would be more difficult. And I'm saying I'm not sure that they were doing something wrong. I'm not sure halachically what they were doing that was wrong, that was incorrect. Yes, from a societal perspective, it's clear you want to get married at a time when it's conducive to procreation, to childbearing. Part of the obligation is to populate the world. That's an obligation that, even though it might fall on the men, cannot be done alone. And therefore, there is a societal expectation that women will get married at an age that's appropriate for childbearing. And in many communities, the earlier the better. The earlier the better. I'll share with you just an interesting statement. There was a Misnagid who approached the Hasidic Rebbe and said to the Hasidic Rebbe, Rebbe, I don't understand. How come you're pushing all of your boys to get married at the age of 18? Right? Why are you're pushing all of your boys to get married at the age of 18? And the Rebbe responded, quoting the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says, Shmona Esrei L'chuppah. Right, that 18 is the ideal age to get married. And the Misnagid said to the Rebbe, sometimes if you daven Shmona Esrei too quickly, you have to daven the Shmona Esrei again, a second time, right? So he was communicating a very subtle message here. There is a point which is too early to get married. I'm not saying 18 is too early to get married, but there is a point which is too early to get married. But there is clearly societal pressure. Beverly, yes. Rabbi? Hey, what happened to Betty today? Okay, all right.
No, I'm Beverly.
I know you're Beverly, but I call him Beverly, and I'm trying to. Where's Betty? Okay, go ahead, Beverly.
Okay, I don't know where Betty is. My question is, we're making an assumption that the stages of a woman's fertility was the same in biblical times as it is
correct
now.
That might not be accurate.
That isn't true.
Well, it might be true, but we might have an advanced medical options that can enable a woman to conceive or give birth to children beyond what was accepted in the days of the Gemara. But you're absolutely right. Right? We're working with that assumption.
In the Torah, there's so many instances of women.
Right. Fern was asking the question based on the Gemara in Baba Basra that we learned last week. So I think the answer is, Fern, I'm not sure that they were doing anything wrong, halachically wrong, in postponing marriage, given the fact that what was their concern? In other words, ladies, what was their concern? Right? I feel like what was their concern? There was why
The nachala was to keep the property in the family.
Correct. Remember, there was a unique consideration regarding this first generation going into the land of Israel, because this first generation going into the land of Israel was going to be dividing up the land according to families, and that was a significant consideration. So it wasn't that Benos Salafad were saying, we're looking around and saying there's not a large number of eligible males that I would consider marrying. That's not what they were saying, right? What they were saying was, given the fact that there's a lack of clarity regarding this inheritance issue, and that would impact on the distribution of the land, the divinely ordained distribution of the land among families, so then we need to wait until there's clarity. So Fern, I think both of those pieces were there. Fern asked the question, she gets to ask a follow-up question. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's somewhat related. Was there an expectation that people marry within the Shevet?
There was certainly an expectation that people marry among the Shevet. What was that expectation based on? Well, we haven't learned yet. But if a woman predeceases her husband, so her husband inherits her estate. So if a woman had let's say a piece of land, let's say that a woman inherited a piece of land in one Shevet, and she wound up marrying a man from another Shevet, and then she predeceases him, so then he from a different Shevet acquires a piece of land that should belong to the other Shevet. So that was exactly the consideration, and we're going to see that the tribe of Menashe, of which Benos Tzlofchad were descended, the tribe of Menashe was upset about the answer that Moshe Rabbeinu gives, precisely for that reason, because the tribe of Menashe was worried that their inheritance was now going to be diminished, because if these Benos Tzlofchad married men from outside of the tribe of Menashe, and they would pass away, so then the men would inherit their property, their real estate, which belonged to the tribe of Menashe. Wait, hold on, Fern, say it again.
But they weren't worried, specifically Menashe, about having property on this side of the Yarden and that side of the Yarden.
No, because
so
that
when
was...
it suited them,
their property.
No, but that was...
asked a different kind
No,
of
but it
question.
didn't suit them. Remember, Moshe Rabbeinu divided up Shevet Menashe, right? Shevet Menashe wasn't divided up on this. It's interesting, right? Because just a few minutes ago, Maura Susan asked this question, right? So the idea...
I love her.
We all do, all right? Right? So she can't see you, right? Right? But the idea, right? I need to put a camera right above there, but then Raylene's going to leave. All right. So the idea, right? The idea here is that Moshe split the tribe of Menashe in order to maintain the connection to Eretz Yisrael. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu did that. It wasn't the tribe of Menashe that did that. It wasn't half the tribe of Menashe that came to Moshe and said, "Hey, listen, we would like to stay on the other side of the Jordan River."
But he didn't do
Right.
for
Okay.
Right, 'cause sometimes
Right, he
it
did. Well, he did it for
gets
Menashe because we know that Menashe was known for their love of the land. We spoke Menashe ben Yosef. We know, right? This is the kesher. This was the connection. Okay, Tina, go ahead.
Maybe I didn't hear right, which is possible. A man married to a woman who has an inheritance, if she never dies before him, he can inherit her plot of land, her real estate.
That is correct. Tina's asking the question. She said that if a man, if a woman has an inheritance, she has karka, she has real estate, she has an inheritance, and she passes away before her husband, does her husband inherit that parcel of real estate? The answer is yes. Then Tina asks the elephant in the room question, which is, does it work the other way? The answer is no. Oh, okay, we're going to get to that. Tina, those of you who can't see on Zoom, Tina is having a conniption on the other side of the room. All right, we're going to come to it. We're going to get there. That's part of our class. That's part of what we're discussing. But we got to get there. Raylene has a question.
So if the daughters could preempt as by marrying and have sons, the daughters could have married men from the tribe earlier on, as soon as their father died, and likely at least one of them would have had a son. So by having a son, it would have kept the line in place, and we would have preempted all of this.
Not necessarily, because a husband inherits a wife before a son inherits a mother. A husband inherits a wife before a son inherits a
But if
mother.
the husband is dead, the father.
All right,
died.
so she would have to plan on killing her husband.
No. The mother is a widow.
If the mother is a widow, so then clearly her son inherits her.
But there's no son, there's the 5 daughters. So at that point, could the
Okay,
5 daughters...
let's try to drill down a little bit. Last question, Tina.
The reason why I'm lot better than 10 cups of coffee. But the reason I'm saying this is that in those days, women didn't have careers. How would
Okay,
they
so Tina is not letting this go. She is obviously distressed at the way in which halacha is treating women.
Yes.
So I'm just gonna tell you, Tina, hang in there, and we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. I promise you, you will see at the end that in actuality, in reality, that a wife is entitled to the majority of the estate of her husband, despite the fact that she doesn't inherit him. And we'll get there, we'll talk about it. But we gotta build a little bit. We gotta build a little bit.
That's the ketubah.
Correct. And where does that come? As the ketubah, where does that come from? And why was it instituted? We're gonna get there. All right, let's go. Okay. You see, imagine if you were all here. Imagine what this dynamic would be like in class if you were all here. We'd be bouncing off the walls. Okay. So here we go. So Fern, so that's an answer to your question. Is that good? Is that okay? Not so sure.
Enough,
It's good
while
enough.
Tina's working on this, just another if I have a grandfather.
Don't encourage Tina right now.
Who's a Kohen, right? And he had only daughters.
Okay, I don't want to get involved in questions of inheritance yet. We're going to get there. Okay? We don't know yet the laws of inheritance. We're all making assumptions that we know what the laws of inheritance are. We don't know. Right? We don't know what the laws of we don't know what the laws of inheritance are. So let's get there. Fern, when we learn the laws of inheritance, you can ask me your question. Okay. Rosie, thanks for letting us know that Mark is there. Okay. So here we go. So what do we have? Right? So we have the following. So these Benos Selofchad come to Moshe and they ask a question to Moshe. They ask a question to Moshe. We don't know what their question is. The Torah doesn't tell us what their question is. What does the Torah tell us? So if you look at their question, what page are we on? 886. If you look at their question on page 886, what do you get? You get the following. They basically say, their question is summed up in Pasuk Dalid, Lama Yigara Shem Avinu Mitoch Mishpachto Ki Ein Lo Bein. Right? Why should our father's name be erased or diminished from amongst his family because he didn't have a son? Give us an inheritance amidst our father's brothers. Okay, so that's what they're asking. That's what they're demanding or asking from Moshe Rabbeinu. Now we learned earlier in the Gemara in Baba Basra that the women, these Benos Selofchad, were not only tzidkanios, but they were also chachmanios, right? They were also smart, right? Because they asked the question at the right time. They asked when Moshe was darshaning the laws of Yibum. They asked while Moshe was darshaning the laws of Yibum. And what do the laws of Yibum say? Yibum is levirate marriage. What do the laws of Yibum say? That if a man dies, leaving his wife childless means no son nor daughter. If a man dies, leaving his wife childless, then the man's brother, the oldest brother, is obligated to marry this woman or release her from that bond and allow her to marry someone else. That is Yibum, that is levirate marriage. That is still practiced today. And when I say still practiced, I mean the obligation still exists. the obligation for a brother to marry his sister, his widowed sister-in-law, if there are no children, still exists. Today, we don't allow a man to fulfill that obligation through yibum. We instead only allow chalitza. And the reason why we only allow chalitza is because for the mitzvah to be done in its essence, it needs to be done lishma. It needs to be done without any ulterior motives, right? And today we don't believe that we have a society, that the values of society have changed, have, I would say, deteriorated, where we can't assume, or we can't be certain that this man is marrying his sister-in-law for pure reasons, lishma. There might be other things going on in the background, and because of that, we only do chalitza today. However, the laws of yibum are very clear. If there is a son, or if there is a daughter, then there's no yibum. There's no yibum. What does that mean? That means that a son and or a daughter continue the name of their father. So it seems clear from the laws of yibum that a daughter, in the absence of a son, should inherit the father's estate. That seems to be part and parcel of the assumptions in the laws of yibum. And the Benot Slavchad knew that. That's why they approached Moshe when he was darshaning the parsha of Yibum, because they were in effect saying, listen, either one way or the other, right? Either we don't count, in which case allow our mother to marry, require our father's brother to marry our mother. Or we do count, in which case we should be able to claim our father's portion as an inheritance. Okay? That's why they were chachmanios. And they knew this because they were darshanios. And this is the Gemara that we learned, these three characteristics of Benos Slavchad. So, wait a second. It seems clear that a daughter, in the absence of a son, should inherit her father. It seems clear. So if it's so clear, why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to bring this question to Hashem? What does the very next pasuk say? The very next pasuk Hey, says, Vayakrev Moshe es mishpatan lifnei Hashem. That what happened? That Moshe brought this question, their judgment, if you will, mishpatan, their judgment, Moshe brought their judgment before Hashem. What does that mean? What does that imply? It implies that Moshe didn't know the answer, right? It implies that Moshe didn't know the answer. And that's why he went to Hashem. We have a similar circumstance that we learned also in the Gemara in Baba Basra, and that was the Mekoshesh Eitzim, who, according to Tosfos, was Tzolafchad, right? This Mekoshesh Eitzim, who went out and violated Shabbos, was going to be executed, but Moshe had to approach Hashem. Why? Because Moshe didn't know the proper method of execution. There are 4 methods of execution. Moshe wasn't sure which method of execution should be meted out to a public desecrator of Shabbos. And so he approached Hashem to gain clarity. This seems to smack of the same thing, that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know the answer, so he approached Hashem. In fact, the Gemara in Baba Basra connects these two. The Gemara in Baba Basra says, yes, it's true. And just like Tzlafchad was responsible for the law being written because, at least according to the Gemara, he had good kavanos, he had a good intention. So too, Benos Tzlafchad are the ones through whom this law is written down, through whom this law was revealed. The implication being that Moshe didn't know this. Wait a second. If Benos Tzlafchad knew it, and the Gemara said they knew it because they were chachmanios, because they were darshanios, and they knew it enough to approach Moshe at this moment. If they knew it, how come Moshe didn't know it? Why did Moshe have to approach Hashem with this question? Okay, so anybody have a suggestion why? Anybody?
This is the first time the land wasn't divided up yet. This is the first time that the laws were being applied.
Okay,
And
so Beverly, right? Beverly is saying, well,
all the circumstances and
but that doesn't explain why he didn't know the answer. I mean, it could be that the answer wasn't necessary to publicize until this moment when the land was being divided up, and we had a situation of a family of daughters with no sons. Yes, that's absolutely true. But the bottom line is, why did Moshe need to approach HaKadosh Baruch Hu with this case? Why didn't Moshe just say, okay, here's the law. The law is if there's no sons, then indeed the daughters do inherit. That is the law.
maybe he felt there was some validity to what they were saying, and he needed for the people to know that the decision came from Hashem rather than from him.
Okay, possible, we're saying, but what we're saying is, it seems that this law was relatively clear, that it was relatively clear to everybody that if a man dies without leaving sons, but does leave daughters, that those daughters would inherit. So again, back to the question of why Moshe Rabbeinu brought this before Hashem. Raylene.
Moshe was going to die before he was allowed to enter into the land. Is it possible he knew the answer and this was just too onerous for him to deliver to the people? Because he was not going to have any part in the actual distribution.
Interesting. So Raylene is suggesting that maybe this was an emotional challenge for Moshe. In other words, maybe Moshe clearly knew the answer, but he just felt it too difficult to give over to the people without divine instruction to do that. Maybe, but he gives over lots of laws to the people of what's going to happen in the land of Israel without this hesitancy. Tina, go ahead.
Is it possible because, maybe the evil part of it was not explored fully, and that is why he was a little tentative about it, because you said that the laws of inheritance, the way it would go is the brother-in-law would marry her. Maybe that wasn't explored enough, and therefore...
Possible. Tina's offering another solution. Let's learn an interesting medrash. It's not clear from the psukim, and I will tell you the approaches go from over here to over here, which should not surprise us, right? Since it's not clear in the psukim, there's actually a liberty of interpretation, and we're going to see that there are approaches that look at this as a sign of praise to Moshe Rabbeinu. That there was a reason why Moshe Rabbeinu knew the halacha, but he nevertheless chose to bring this before Hashem. And there are those who look at it from a perspective of Genai. It's not so favorable to Moshe Rabbeinu. So there's a great medrash, a fascinating medrash that appears in Bamidbar Rabbah. And what does this medrash in Bamidbar Rabbah say? It's discussing why Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know this halacha. Actually, before we do the medrash, let's look at Rashi, because Rashi brings down the Gemara. Often we'll see, as we see in this case, what appears in the Gemara also appears in the medrash, right? The Gemara and the medrash were contemporaries, if you will. So it's not unusual that something that appears in the Gemara also appears in the Medrash. Rashi brings it down. What does Rashi say? So if you are looking at Rashi, Rashi is at the top of the second column, the left column on page 886, the third line down. Actually, the Third line down in bold, at the end of the line is the heading, Vayakrev Moshe es Mishpatan. Says Rashi, beginning of the fourth line down, Nis alma halacha mimenu. What does Rashi say? Moshe Rabbeinu forgot the halacha. Nis alma, right? Lihis alei means to disappear, right? Moshe, the halacha disappeared from Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu forgot the halacha, okay? And why did Moshe Rabbeinu forget the halacha? Says Rashi, V'kan nifra. Here, Moshe Rabbeinu is getting punished, paid back, if you will, getting punished. Al shanatal atara, because he took for himself a crown, and atara is a crown. He took for himself a crown, lomar, by saying, V'hadavar asher yikshem mikem takrivun alai. And the matter which is too hard for you, you should bring to me. Where is that? Jump up ahead in Chumash to Perek Aleph. Yes, but it's mentioned in Devarim. Jump up ahead to Perek Aleph. Pasuk Yud Zayin. You don't have to go so far. Perek Aleph, Pasuk Yud Zayin is on page 942. And here Moshe Rabbeinu is recounting, right, what happened after Bnei Yisrael left Egypt and Yisrael came and Yisrael offered this advice. We read this parsha not so long ago, and Moshe Rabbeinu says in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Lo sakiru panim, this is the judges, they shouldn't show favoritism by mishpat regarding judgment. Kakaton, kagadol, tishmaun. Doesn't matter if the person is important or not important, you have to listen to them. Lo saguru mipnei ish, at the same time, you should not shirk your responsibilities in the face of a powerful person. Ki ha-mishpat le'lokimhu, because ultimately God is in charge of judgment. V'hadavar asher yikshem mikem, and the matter which is too hard for you, takrivun elai, bring it to me. What does that sound like? It sounds like a little bit of arrogance. It sounds like a little bit of arrogance. What is Moshe Rabbeinu saying? He's saying, listen, set up these courts, but you know what? When you come to something really hard, you come to me and I'll do it. I'll deal with it. Right? It seems as if Moshe is displaying a bit of arrogance, which is troubling. Because what do we say about Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu was Anav Mikol Adam. He was the humblest person alive. He was the humblest person alive. So how do we justify an attitude of arrogance, v'hadavar hakasheh, right? Whatever is too difficult for you, bring to me, with this concept that Moshe Rabbeinu was a tremendously humble person. So perhaps we can justify it by saying that humility doesn't mean that you don't appreciate your abilities, right? Humility doesn't mean that you denigrate yourself. That's not what humility is. Humility means you understand your position. And regarding HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe understood his position. He was the humblest of people vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But at the same time, Moshe Rabbeinu learned Torah directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu had the best teacher. Moshe Rabbeinu knew the answers. Moshe Rabbeinu attained, perhaps, certainly the 49 levels of wisdom, maybe even the 50th level of wisdom. Hold that thought for next week. We'll come back to that. But Moshe Rabbeinu certainly was the wisest of people. And this idea that, V'hadavar hakashet, takrivun alai, bring whatever's too hard for you, bring to me, is not an untrue statement. And it doesn't mean that Moshe didn't have humility. He did have humility. But at the same time, having humility doesn't mean that you need to denigrate yourself. It means you can have humility, and at the same time, you can understand what your abilities are, what your position is, what your responsibilities are. That doesn't contradict humility. So that's how we can understand these two. Nevertheless, despite that explanation, there is a shmidgen, right? A very important word, shmidgen. There is a shmidgen of a little bit of arrogance here that was inappropriate for Moshe. Maybe it could have been said in a different way. right? Maybe the idea which Moshe conveyed should have been conveyed in a different way. And according to Rashi quoting the Gemara in Maseches Sota, Moshe Rabbeinu is being punished for this by forgetting a halacha. Do we have other examples of individuals who were punished for their haughtiness, for their arrogance, by forgetting halacha?
King David?
Oh, so exactly right. So Raylene answered King David, and that is precisely what the Medrash Rabbah brings. It brings the story of David HaMelech. And in order to understand the story of David HaMelech, we have to go back in Jewish history. When did David HaMelech live? David HaMelech lived approximately the year 1900 BCE. There was no Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash had not been built yet. The Aron Kodesh was still being moved around. The enemies of Bnei Yisrael in the days of David were primarily the Plishtim, the Philistines, right? Primarily the Plishtim who lived in Gaza, right? They were the enemies of Bnei Yisrael. It's interesting how history repeats itself, right? And we know, we learned about Shimshon and Shimshon's heroism, even though he might not have been the guy you want your daughter to marry, but the heroism of Shimshon in fighting against the Pelishtim. But we also know that Bnei Yisrael, didn't always deserve to be victorious over the Pelishtim. And there is an incident that's recorded in Sefer Shmuel of Bnei Yisrael going out to war against the Pelishtim without consulting with Hashem and taking the Aron Kodesh out with them into battle. The Aron Kodesh was taken out by the two sons of Eli, who was the Kohen Gadol at the time. Eli was the Kohen Gadol at the time. Remember, there was no Beis HaMikdash. He was the Kohen Gadol of the Mishkan, right? He was the Kohen Gadol who served in the Mishkan. Eli was the Kohen Gadol. The whole story of Chana, who was Shimshon's, right? The whole story of Chana came about during the time of Eli, right? So what do we have? So we have Eli's two sons taking the Aron into battle against the Pelishtim, unauthorized, but they imagined that Hashem would never allow Bnei Yisrael to be defeated if that would mean the capture of the Aron, and they were wrong. And what happened? They were killed. The Aron Kodesh was captured by the Pelishtim. The news came back to Eli and what happened. And when Eli heard it, Eli fell over backwards. He was a very obese individual, and he died. Right? That was the story. The Aron Kodesh is now by the Pelishtim. It doesn't stay there very long. Why? Because the Pelishtim suffer from significant medical issues. Because they had the Aron Kodesh. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu punishes them physically for having possession of the Aron Kodesh. And the Pelishtim understand that their physical maladies are coming as a result of the having this Aron Kodesh, and they send the Aron Kodesh back. They send the Aron Kodesh back. And the Aron Kodesh winds up in a particular place, and David decides that he's going to bring the Aron Kodesh to Yerushalayim. He's going to bring the Aron Kodesh to Yerushalayim, and he's going to do it
Celebration.
With a huge pomp and circumstance, and he's going to do it by putting the Aron Kodesh on a wagon, right? On a wagon, and being led by two oxen, being guided by two brothers, the two brothers of the home where the Aron Kodesh was currently, and they would bring it back to Yerushalayim. That's the backstory to what our Medrash is now going to tell us. okay?
When Ellie passed away, who took his place? Ellie.
I don't remember.
Do you remember?
I don't remember. Who became the Kohen Gadol after Eli? I don't remember.
So his children.
His two sons were killed.
Now, who's the ones, I didn't quite, who?
I mean, this was a time of Shmuel. Shmuel was the Navi at the time, right? Eli raised Shmuel with Shmuel, but I don't know that Shmuel was the Kohen Gadol. I'm not sure.
Who took, you said two brothers accompanied the Arab?
Yes. Yeah. Let's focus in on the Medrash. I don't want to get too distracted. Let's focus in on the Medrash to understand what happens. Right? So what do we have? So the Medrash tells us as follows. It's a Medrash actually on our Parsha, on the Pasuk, Vayakrev Moshe es Mishpatan Lifnei Hashem, exactly our Pasuk. And the Medrash begins by referring to another incident. Right? Sheyesh tzadikim sheniska'u b'devar mitzvah. There were righteous people. They're called tzadikim. There were righteous people. Sheniska'u. What is niska'u? Became arrogant. Right? Right? There were tzadikim, righteous people who became arrogant or boastful. B'devar mitzvah. Right? Regarding a mitzvah. What mitzvah in particular? The Meforshim say the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Right, that they were haughty in their knowledge, right? And what happened as a result of that haughtiness? V'hitish hakadosh baruch hu es kochan, and Hakadosh Baruch Hu deliberately, as a result of their haughtiness, weakened their strength in the area in which they were being haughty, and where do we see this? At Motzei, we see this Sha'amar David in the case of David. Because what did David say? In Tehillim, David says, Zemiros hayulichu kecha. What does the word Zemiros mean? Songs. We sing Zemiros at the Shabbos table, right? Zemiros means songs. Zemiros hayulichu kecha. Your chukecha, your laws, your chukim were like songs to me. Now, on the one hand, you know, when we listen to that, we say, that's a nice thing, right? Everybody likes a song, you know. So David HaMelech was saying, Hashem, I love your chukim as much as I love the music of Yishai Ribo, right? You know, I love your music as much as I love your chukim as much as I love the music of Avram Fried, whatever it is, right? So on the one hand, that could sound positive, but the Medrash understands it not in a positive way. And what is it? Diminishing of chukim by comparing them to songs. Lomar, this means to say, what was David HaMelech communicating according to the Medrash? Shekalos urigilos kizmiros. That your laws are as easy to understand and as routine as Zemiros, right? Not looking at it in a positive way at all. That David HaMelech was saying this, you know, to say, Kadosh Baruch Hu, I know so much that your laws, it's like a Star Spangled Banner for me, right? Or like, like David Melech Yisrael, whatever it is, okay? Right? So that was David HaMelech's statement. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Chayecha, by your life. In other words, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not take this lightly, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Chayecha, by your life, Shesofcha litaos bidavar shahatinokos karin. You're going to make a mistake in something that every child knows. In other words, this was right. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you David HaMelech, you think you're so knowledgeable that my laws are to you as inconsequential as songs. So you're going to be punished. You're going to make a mistake in something that is so clear that even children in Maura Susan's class know it. Right? Something so clear. Okay? By the way, that's not so clear. I mean, Talmidei Chachamim in Maura Susan's class. So it's not just so clear.
One way of reading it, you can read it a different way. You can read it L'Sheva. you know?
Correct, but our Medrash doesn't read it that way. Our Medrash reads it as, our Medrash reads it in a historical context, because this comes along to explain what happens with David. And what happens with David? Keshehe'ela es ha'aron, when David HaMelech brought the Aron to Yerushalayim,
He danced.
what happened? Ta'a unisano al ha'agala. David HaMelech put the Aron on a wagon. Now, the Pelishtim put the Aron on a wagon because they didn't know any better, right? They didn't know any better. That made sense to them. But David should have known better.
Right.
Why should David have known better? Because the Torah tells us that the Aron Kodesh needs to be carried. It needs to be carried by Shevet Levi, by Bnei Merari. It needs to be carried. It's not something, there were wagons for the other items of the Mishkan that were transported in the Midbar. There were wagons to carry the beams, but the Aron Kodesh had to be carried on the shoulders of the Leviim. The Aron Kodesh, we read in last week's Parsha. Hold on just a second. We read in last week's Parsha of the staves, right? The wooden poles that went through the rings of the Aron Kodesh and could not be removed from the Aron Kodesh. That's how the Aron Kodesh was carried. And not only that, but the Aron Kodesh really wasn't carried. The Aron Kodesh carried itself. The Aron Kodesh carried itself. So something which was so fundamental, something which is a pasuk in Chumash, every child knows. Every child who learns, right, every child who learns this knows that the Aron Kodesh is supposed to be carried by Shevet Levi, not put in a wagon. And yet David HaMelech forgot it. David HaMelech forgot it. As a result of his arrogance, in saying that your chukim are like zmiros. So interesting. So maybe this is a little bit of a raya that when you forget something, it's not because you're getting old, right? You forget something. Why? Because the Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted you to forget it for a particular reason. Maybe it's a shtuch for something else. I don't know, right? But the idea is that David HaMelech forgot it. Okay, we had a couple of questions before we continue.
Yeah.
Fern, go ahead.
I've collected 4 of them. This is not good. Moshe realized that he did know, David didn't. There's a big difference. And maybe I'll connect this to another question. Maybe part of what the pasuk in Devarim is trying to show us, and I know it's not classical thought, is that Moshe says, bring you my question. I have a direct line to Hashem. I'll give you the answer. You need to know when to ask your local Rav and when you should be asking for yourself. I think there was a pedagogical reason there.
Okay, so if you remember, I mentioned that the interpretation of this pasuk, Vayakrev Moshes Mishpatan Lifnei Hashem, goes from one extreme to the other. Right. We're going to come to your position. We're going to come to your understanding. There are meforshim who were mechavein to exactly what you're suggesting. That Moshe's bringing this was a sign, was a pedagogical example to Bnei Yisrael of what to do when you have a question that's difficult. Even if you think you know the answer, what to do when you have a question that's difficult. But I'm starting at the other end. Okay, Fern?
Okay.
Starting at the other end. Go ahead.
Thank you. Why specifically was it this halacha that Moshe forgot from all the halachot? And the other question is, how did the Benot Tzlafchad, who lived in a house of females, know exactly when Moshe was darshaning Yivamo?
Okay,
In other words, was there a
so
public agenda?
So if you remember, I don't know if you remember, but last week I mentioned that I was thinking back to the Concord and the Neville, and what was the other one? Grossingers, right? I forgot the Avi Avosatum. Right, back to Grossingers, right? Homoac, the Homoac. Right, back to Grossingers, right? That there was a a poster,
daily schedule.
right? A daily schedule, right? When they would do Simon Says, and when they would do, and when there would be pool time, and when there would be dinner, and when there would be snacks. So, right? So we're assuming that it was that there was some way for them to know that it was post. Remember, they were Chachmanios and they were Darshanios, so they obviously they were learning. Obviously, they were learning also, and they had no problem. And remember, they had no problem. They had no problem showing up, you know, in front of Moshe and Moshe and Elazar and Nasi. They had no problem being there. So these were not you know, I don't know. These were not you know, Beis Yaakov girls that were afraid to. They were not right. Correct. Maybe Beis Yaakov girls is a bad example. All right. I have Chedva online. I have Chedva online and I have Chava online. So we're not saying anything bad about Beis Yaakov girls. My daughter-in-law teaches in a Beis Yaakov, so I'm not saying anything bad about it. Wait. So Fern, did we get all your questions?
No. Why? Just one left. Two were put on the side. Why specifically was it this halacha that Moshe forgot?
Okay, so remember we said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was planning that this halacha be revealed through the medium of people who loved Eretz Yisrael. So it's appropriate that this halacha, which has to do with the love of Eretz Yisrael, the dividing up of the land of Eretz Yisrael, would be the one that came about through Beno Slavcha. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu was looking for a place where he could cause Moshe Rabbeinu to forget, this would be the appropriate place to do it. Okay, so, wait, hold on hang on just a second. Did anybody else have a question online? No. Tina, go ahead. Last question for the day.
It's an observation. If you look at, you know, contextually, how these courts were set up, you know, Yisrael said to him, you know, you make the lower courts, the middle courts, the higher courts.
I'll repeat what she's saying.
It follows contextually how the courts were set up.
No, correct. Tina's defending Moshe Rabbeinu. Tina's defending the fact Moshe Rabbeinu was positioning himself as the Supreme Court. And that makes sense. So again, you know, as I mentioned earlier, not everybody interprets that pasuk liganai. Our Medrash interprets it liganai, but not everyone interprets it liganai. We're out of time, okay? But we didn't finish the story of what happens with the Aron Kodesh. We'll finish that next week. We'll connect it. We'll connect it to Moshe Rabbeinu, and then we'll look at some other. Approaches to this question, and as we unpack this, we'll try to gain an understanding of the laws of inheritance and how they're set out. Okay, everybody have a great week. Yes, Rosie.
If Ellie was a little more sensitive to Hannah, maybe it would have turned out differently.
Correct. That could be.
I wrote you the rest.
Right, and his sons were not tzaddikim either, as Fern points out. Correct.
Right.
Correct.
But they were tzaddikim b'doram.
All right. Good to see everybody. Nice to have everybody with us. Come back, please.